Do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in miracles? Thank you. Over the last few hundred years, there's been an intentional drive by many people, maybe well-intentioned, but very often intellectual, elite people, empiricists, scientists, that have attempted to try to explain away miracles. And this has happened probably for the last 300 or 400 years. Probably most notably would be the British empiricist named David Hume. And David Hume said, he was a scientist, and he said, we can't explain miracles and therefore we must reject them. They're outside of the order of nature. And because science can't explain them, we must ignore them. Another Englishman named C.S. Lewis, most famous for writing the Chronicles of Narnia, explained that if a scientist sees what is evident before him and can't explain it, it means he can't explain it. It doesn't mean that you must reject it. He said, because you see, it's scientists who deny what is observable and that what they see they can't explain. And so therefore, their attitude is unscientific. And so the church, of course, knows that things happen outside of nature, and so they say miracles are possible. Most notably in our country, one of the founding fathers of our country, whose name just left my brain, he cut apart the Bible. He went through the Gospels and he cut out every section that included a miracle, something unexplainable. So when Jesus cures somebody's eyes, he cuts that out and says, no, that's not believable. Thomas Jefferson was his name. And then he closed the Bible and said, there. Now there is a book that I can believe in. Today we hear the story of a man whose sight is cured. And this happened 2,000 years ago, or more or less. But the question is, does this stuff still happen today? Several months ago, I was having dinner in Oshkosh with Father Matt Seminar. Maybe some of you remember him. He was here at Holy Innocents at one point in his ministry. He was actually the last one to stay in the same room that I'm in now he was the last one to stay there before I got here. And I told him that. He said, oh, did you have to do some exorcisms on the room before you moved in? And I said, Father Matt, I didn't even need the lights because it was still glowing with the radiance of your holiness. Priests talk in such nerdy ways. And as we're eating dinner, two women approached us. I recognized immediately that both of them were parishioners from the city of Winneconne. And one of them I had brought into the church just 3 years before that. And she said, Father, you'll never guess what happened to me. And I said, yes, tell me. Well, we were on this day trip, this pilgrimage to the shrine up in Champion, Wisconsin, where in 1858, apparently Our Lady had appeared there, and it was confirmed by Bishop Ricken a few years ago that it was in fact worthy of belief. And she said, I went up there with Father Edward Looney, who's now the parochial vicar at St. Raphael in Oshkosh, and we took this pilgrimage, and on the way up, he said, make sure when you go to the shrine you have some prayer requests. And she had never heard that before. She said, okay, I know I pray for my families and stuff, but he said, don't pray for simple things, pray for something extraordinary. And so she went and began to make intercession like she normally did for her family and friends, and for her too, and something at the end of her prayer prompted her to say, I'd like to be able to see out of my right eye. You see, because of a cancer that she had growing behind her eye, it had impacted the ocular nerve, and she wasn't able to see anymore out of her eye. And so she only had one. And so she just threw that prayer out there thinking, well, God can't probably do that anyways, or maybe he wouldn't. After they had spent some time in the shrine, they walked around to the grave where Sister Adele Breesy, who was the visionary, had been buried. And as she was looking at her gravestone, she noticed something. That what was once dark in her right eye, she suddenly began to see as light. She thought it was very strange, and the friends that she wished she didn't tell because she wasn't quite sure she believed it herself. So after they had stopped at the grave and read what was to read there, they began to walk around the shrine to the gift shop. Now, what would a Catholic shrine be without a gift shop? So they got into the gift shop, and by the time they finished looking around there, she realized that that eye was completely healed. She could see everything. The strangest line she said that night was, and it always stuck with me, "I could see, but I didn't believe it, because it was too extraordinary." Finally, she told Father Edward about it in private, in confidence, and Father Edward, as most priests do, they take these things in stride because they believe that this is possible through God. And so she eventually went to the doctor, and the doctor, when she didn't say anything, had her do a little test, and she started being able to read numbers, giving evidence that she could see out of that eye. And the doctor said, "What happened?" And he explained to her. There was no natural explanation for what happened and how she was now able to see out of that eye, and that cause, as far as I know, is still under investigation, because Sister Adele Brees is not a saint yet, but they would like to make her one. And you need a miracle for evidence. What's funny about that whole story is, and it dawned on me as she was telling me, is that Adele Brees as a child had an accident with her eye, and she was blinded in it. You see, God still works in wondrous ways. Those are miracles. Those are extraordinary. They tend to get us excited about the faith, and God gives us those miracles to move us along. But today in the gospel, Jesus does something very extraordinary or ordinary with the man born blind. What does he do first? He enters into this man's life. The guy doesn't ask him. And he puts mud on his eyes. Spits on the ground, makes mud, and puts it on his eyes. Does that remind you of anything? Go back to the beginning of the Bible in the 2nd chapter of Genesis. God had made the earth, but he wanted to make creatures in his own image and likeness, and so he took clay from the ground, he took dirt from the earth, and he blew the breath of life into the dirt, and it was the very dawn of humanity. After the fall of Adam and Eve, humanity needed to be remade. And so Jesus symbolically is spitting into this dirt, putting it on this man whose eyes were blind, singling an imperfection, in order that he could heal him and show us the healing that God wants to give us. What's the next order? Go wash in the pillow of Siloam. What did he wash with? Water. What is that a symbol of? Baptism. But the clay represented Jesus' desire for us to be remade through the clay that he once used to create us, and now through the waters of baptism being regenerated. Why did the Pharisees reject and object to it? Well, like the rationalists, I suppose, that would deny the miracles, they wanted to stay in control. You see, they had a nice little thing going. As long as they could convict people that they were stuck in their sins, they could continuously bring them to the temple as God had ordered, and they could sell them things. They could sell them lambs without blemish. They were compromised by their own desire for power. That's why it's so very obvious, and if you have a chance, reread this gospel today. It's so obvious what's going on. We can see that the Pharisees are missing something. The blind man can see that the Pharisees are missing something. The blind man's parents can see that the Pharisees are missing something because they've been compromised by something they want to hold on to and control. Friends, the point of this homily is this. In this, from the very beginnings of the church, since people were trying to explain who this Jesus figure is, and they did it in the most simple way. God became one of us. God came to share in our humanity so that we could be remade in his likeness and share in his divinity. Every sacrament that we have is like that mud or that water. It's a visible sign to point us to an invisible reality. To heal the body is easy. The woman that I spoke to that night, this man who was born blind, they will eventually die. Their sight will be taken from them again. But through the waters of baptism, God has given us a share in the divine life. And it's important for us to own that. That's why we have the sacraments, 7 instituted by Christ, visible signs that give us the invisible reality of his grace to live and to follow Jesus according to his will. Our first reading tells us, do not judge by appearances. Do we judge by appearances when we see the sacraments? Or do we recognize, like all of those in the story, what's going on interiorly? Do we ask the Lord for that transformation that he so earnestly desires to give us, so that we can share in his divine nature? So friends, this week ask in prayer and supplication for what you need, and ask the Lord and trust that he will give it to you. Let go of the control. Know that the Lord wants, as he once made you, to remake you into the person you know you ought to be and the person that he wants to make you. And so let's ask boldly for that this week as we move closer to this Paschal mystery and the great feast of Easter.